Welcome to another video of Geospinach. Today, it's one of our last videos on the concept of the Confederal States of Europe. And each video acts independently and we argue on one topic. And in this video, we're going to talk about the concept of the right to secede, the general economics of such a system, the legal system, and specifically some questions that Paris will ask me. Paris is a Polish Cypriot, a lawyer, and he's here to help me guide through the debate. Also, any questions you have, add them below, and if we have enough questions, we're going to do another Q&A session answering those questions. Paris, let's start with you.
Perfect. Thank you, Andreas. So essentially, moving into this topic that we're going to discuss today, I was also considering the initial creation of such confederacy. In your opinion, what should be the catalyst for the initial movement to create this confederacy, as you say? For example, let's take the example of the US, as we did in our previous videos. The creation of the federal system, as we know it today, essentially came down after the Civil War, which necessitated a creation of a unified state federal system. What would be the equivalent in modern day Europe to create this confederacy? Why would a state in Europe now, or any state in the European Union, choose to be part of this confederacy? What would be that initial push?
Well, my answer will be quite simple in this, that Europe, the catalyst also has already been created. The catalyst is, the Second World War. After the Second World War, we went into the path of European integration. Now, in the 1950s, no one ever imagined that within 50 years, we're going to have a free movement of peoples, a common currency, a partial lingua franca, and normalization of state relations within Europe. And most importantly, people going from one country and working to the other country with no implications whatsoever. My argument is that this process has already started. Now, Europe as a concept, it will either fail, and will fail miserably so, or it will eventually succeed into a federal system. And in my opinion, that it already moves towards a federal system. The states that don't want to be part of it will eventually drop off, and the ones that remain will choose to be part of this federal system. Now, this inevitability of maintaining such outcome is my argument that the reason Germany is created today, the German Confederacy that inevitably became the Second Reich and then the Third Reich and then the German Republic, the United States of America that even passed through a massive civil war and it still managed to maintain its identity. So imagine the American Civil War, like 500,000 dead, hatred between states being all-time high, like people just killed each other. 50 years later, they're fighting the same war, just kind of forgot everything that happened before that. In Europe, the struggles between the states have been so fierce for more than 1,500 years, but killing each other for more than 1,500 years. And after the Second World War, we just changed course altogether. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the integration of Eastern Europe and Southern Europe into the EU massively increased this rapid integration process of Europe. So I believe we are already in the path of integrating Europe. But on that question, I'm going to add another topic, which is the strongest one, which personally still don't know the feasibility around it, the right to secede. Now, currently with the EU, it was quite complicated to secede something that you already have free movement of peoples and so forth. So what happens in a confederal state? Should each state just have the right to secede? Wouldn't that increase the probability of such a state in hard times to crumble? And I think, yes, in hard times, it will eventually crumble if it has the right to secede. So my opinion, which is, I'm not absolute in this, is that each state should have the right to secede. But the reason is each state will choose to secede in times where times are really bad. And in times where times are really bad is where, in many cases, you actually require such a state to be more unified. So for that to be achieved, in my opinion, and the more fair way to do it is have a system of absolute majority or supreme majority in a seceding process. A majority where at least 65% of the population will have to agree on seceding. Because if we have what the British had, a very close margin of voting out, and then you have the argument, well, the majority of the older people wanted to get out, but the majority of the younger people wanted to stay in. But this decision is not for the current generation, but it's for the future generation. So in that argument, the vote in literally 30 years' time, it will be like 40-60, 60 in favor. If we take ceteris paribus, the current numbers. So what did they vote for? You are voting for secession for the future. And inevitably, especially in bad times, you might have an older generation be less willing, more willing to change, or even the inverse, a younger generation becoming very nationalistic and wanting to break off. That's why I'm much in favor in the idea of absolute majorities or supreme majorities of 60 or 65% to be able to secede, as to be a very important majority of people that will choose to leave. And if that majority exists, so 65% exists, it means that something really bad is happening within that confederacy, and that's the reason for the existence of the confederacy. Well, it shouldn't exist. Simple as that. I mean, you shouldn't force people to stay somewhere they don't want to be in. The second question is, how often do you allow it? Well, you're going to have a system, you're going to allow states to secede every, let's say, 15 years or 20. Like, if they choose to secede, then they can do that again, let's say, in 15 years. So you wouldn't have referendums literally every year for secession. Outside of that, though, I do believe that each state should have the right to secede in the concept of supreme thing, but take into account the state defense. So what do I mean by that? If the Confederacy is close to war with one of its neighbors, and some countries are starting to be like, oh, we're going to secede, then the Confederal government should have the right to at least postpone that secession process. Not stop it, but at least postpone it for the benefit of the whole. But it's very important not to stop it. Yes, the US has succeeded, well, very beautifully so, but at what cost? Well, it has succeeded by becoming much stronger, the federal government, at the expense of the states, to the point now that no state can actually secede. My argument is that you should allow them the choice to secede, but it should be under the premise of supreme majority. Yes, Barry.
But Andreas, if you allow the system of secession, essentially, from the Confederacy, then if the Confederacy inherently is not strong enough and homogeneous and united enough, if one state starts to have thoughts of secession, then that might have a domino effect on the other states if the Confederacy at that point in time is troubled or weak or not united enough.
Well,
and then after, how do you ensure that if you allow one state to secede, for example, let's say you have a confederacy and then Austria in the middle, if it's still called Austria, secedes, then you have a big hole, both geographically and as a system, you have a hole in the middle with a country missing, and then potentially Poland will want to secede. And then how? At what point?
That is the difference that I want to argue. That's the whole concept. If it doesn't work, it shouldn't work to begin with. If you have a concept of supreme majority of 65%, and these 65% are like, fuck this, I'm much better off defending my own land. Doesn't work at all. It doesn't provide me with anything. I'm much better off being alone than this being part of this union. Then this union shouldn't exist to begin with. I'm not against this idea. It shouldn't exist. Simple as that. You shouldn't just have a state just to have a state. It's not the idea that we want grandeur for the case of grandeur. We just have to be bigger because we are big. No, of course, some bureaucrats within that confederal state and the ones in the strongest states will always want to maintain the bigger the state as to get the benefit of such a bigger state. But if that thing doesn't work and you have practically in dictatorship of the majority, where you have Northern Europe practically benefiting much more than Southern Europe, then Southern Europe can just secede. If they want to create their own state, let them. That's this confederal state should be built upon the principle of protection of property rights and liberty. And what is liberty if you don't have a choice to what happens to your state and your country? That is the premise of liberty. So yes, they should have the right to secede, because if by supreme majority people still choose to secede, it means something is terribly wrong with the system. And I think this should have been the norm in Europe at this point. Now, on this topic, we should go to the legal part of the discussion, how you legally control state. Well, we mentioned throughout the video, the idea is that you have a system where you have some generic property rights protections and some generic higher court, but outside of that, each different system will have its own way and their own regularities. The argument is that, well, all of the systems should work through one legal approach. My opinion is common law is always better than civil law. But because the majority of European states at this moment are based around civil law, Code Napoleon, then inevitably it will converge to a civil law system. Doesn't matter, it has to converge to one or the other. Once it has converged to one of the other, then the confederal higher court system wouldn't have the ability to enforce almost nothing on the state system, especially in regards to education, a way of life, taxation, and so forth. It will only be able to do so when it comes to actual big crimes, have the authority to arrest someone, for example, and under the concept of general rules. Like that, in my opinion, will be the premise of a legal system. Yes.
So a supreme legal system in such confederacy would govern which specific areas? Because as you said, for example, there's some states in the confederacy which might be governed by common law, which common law and then in turn is sometimes derived from traditions, from local customs. For example, some things in some states might be illegal because of the culture around that thing, whereas in another state, maybe even neighboring state, might be legal. So how do you balance that top system of that will control the federal system, legal system? What exactly will it govern? How it will, because for it to govern something, it has to be homogeneous.
That's the thing. Oh no, that's what it should be homogeneous, but it shouldn't actually govern. That's
sorry, I meant in terms of control.
But it shouldn't control. It shouldn't have a legal control. It should be more like a regulator control. For example, the current EU legal system is the supreme legal system across Europe. And we have a very weird situation where you have a civil law system and some countries have common law system. And then you have Poland, which wants the right of their own courts being above the EU, and the EU doesn't approve of that. And then you have the cases where the EU Supreme Court sides with things that individual countries right now do not appreciate, or it's against their own culture. This is not what we want in a confederal system. The idea that within the confederal system, each one lives the way it wants to live. The only existence of this grand supreme confederal judging system, it will be only for the protection of the constitution of such a system. It will be a constitutionally based court. And that's why I much prefer the United States Constitution in contrast to the EU Constitution, because it's very small, but it's very precise in what it means. So in that grander scheme of things, it wouldn't have a Supreme Court where you can take cases to the Supreme Court. It's more about, guys, you just passed the law that you're allowed to kill people. You can't do that. Like, stop it. Like, but outside of that, no, they couldn't have the right to change the way of life of individuals. The practically Supreme Court will be each state will having its own. Now, you will have cases where someone has committed a crime in one state and then moves to another which is legal. Well, the regulatory system will be like, okay, if you already knew that it was illegal to do it in that state, which you probably knew already, then you should be arrested, be taken back there, pay the price, and then come back. Because the idea is that currently we know that in the Netherlands you are allowed to smoke weed. In Cyprus, you are not. A Cypriot knows that in the Netherlands you are allowed to do, but in Cyprus you are not. So if you go to the Netherlands and smoke weed and come back to Cyprus and you are high, you can't be punished. You did it legally. If you smoke weed, and if a Dutch person comes to Cyprus and smokes weed here, he should be arrested. Well, in this system, he has to be aware to begin with that, okay, I can't do that here. This is their way of life. This is the way they live. I can't go there and change it. He's going to be here. He's going to be punished. You can have a system of maybe a different punishment, but with an exclusion from the state. I don't know. System of those lines. Like, okay, you don't go to prison, you pay this fine, but you are not allowed to come here again. Something on those lines. The idea is that you protect your each individual communities. And the beauty of it, and that's what I like about the confederal system, is that you're going to have various states introducing very unique laws by themselves. Some of them might look extreme, some of them might look very liberal. And then gradually, through a trial and error process, one state is going to learn from the mistakes of another state. Like you're going to see debates being like, that state implemented that law of deregulation, of decreased taxation, and they benefited a lot. I want that in my state. Let's do this. If your state refuses to do that, then you just migrate to that state. Your state will eventually move away. So in the start, it will be really complicated, but I believe because of this trial and error, and in contrast to what we have right now, you have one system, and that one system does trial and error and it learns. You have 40 different systems doing trial and error at the same time, many of them failing, but many of them succeeding. And thus the learning curve of success, of legalistic success, in my opinion, and documentation of what laws work and what laws don't work will gradually become more prevailing and proving, because you're going to have a lot of different laws and a lot of data of all of these laws, some of them working, some of them not working. And in 100 years' time, you'll be like, okay, it's obvious that these laws have been tried in 38 of the states in this period of time. They don't work, so we just don't implement it. Even if we are liberal-minded, want to implement them. You just increase the rate of natural selection, but in the state level.
Absolutely, I agree with you, but in the sense that it would be like the system in the United States, but very diluted, in the sense that there is a federal legal system, but as you said, it's going to be only constitutional, just to maintain the constitution essentially of the Confederacy.
It will be mainly, in my opinion, disagreements between the states themselves.
Absolutely. In contrast to individual control of
yes,
people.
It will be, in my opinion, let's say state A and state B. State B track that there is weapons coming from state A. And they don't approve of weapons coming from state A. Let's say weapons in state A are legal, but in state B, they are illegal. Then the state A should respect the right of state B not to have weapons in their state. So this thing is going to go to state A and be like, okay, I don't know what you're going to do. I don't care what you're going to do. Don't put weapons to state B. They have the right not to have weapons. That's their choice.
Absolutely.
As long, for example, as state B has some control in their borders, for example, checking weapons, then it's the job of the state A to implement, not the overspilling of regulations. But it will be, in my opinion, mainly for the controversies between different states.
Absolutely. And also the fact that you're going to have different states, just as in the US, for example, in relation to one state has open carry for weapons, whereas other state has a concealed carry. So open carry in that state is illegal, whereas in the other state it's legal. In the same way as you described, one state will one action will be legal, the other one in the other won't be legal. But then you can, as you said, adjust and adapt in regards to laws that you implement in each state, accordingly to what other states are doing and how well they are doing and how successful their laws and regulations are.
Yes.
So I think that's a quite good system.
And the last topic, which is going to be really, really easy to answer, how about the economics of this system? Well, when it comes to fiscal policy, free for all, whatever you want. One state can be full welfare state, mother state giving money to everyone. The other one will be full deregulations tax system. No control whatsoever. Each one decides upon itself. Now, when it comes to monetary policy, things change dramatically. Many people don't like the Federal Reserve and the ECB and, let's say, the negative consequences they have, the way they influence the market. The system I personally much admire, and I think it's the system that fits perfectly within a Confederal States of Europe, is either a Chicago School approach of monetary policy, where you have a free floating currency, but you have a very non-changing interest rate as not to affect the market, so not to send wrong signals in the market. But personally, I much prefer the Austrian system of just having a gold standard or something very close to a gold standard, something to abide to keep the currency stable. So you don't need a Federal Reserve anyway. This is the price of gold. You can exchange it with these amounts of dollars or euros. And outside of that, you just use this currency. And okay, I'm going to make different videos in regards to Austrian monetary policy. So I'm not going to go into that specifically, but the concept is that the currency should be just stable and non-intervening at all. That is the main principle. Barry, do you have any more questions in regards to this topic?
I think just a small question which I think can be answered quickly is just, as we said, it's a common language in our previous videos. Is it also a common currency?
Yeah, yes, you have to have
Absolutely,
it. Yeah. You have to have a common currency.
Currency, yeah.
Because free movement of peoples with no common currency, just the complications it creates is massive.
Absolutely, yeah.
And quite a waste of productivity, labor, and so forth. So yes, a common currency should exist.
Perfect. Yes. Just a clarification on that.
Thank you for this, Barry. And according to the reactions we receive, we see we're going to make more videos, getting more into details with questions that people might have on this topic. Thank you guys for watching, and please like and subscribe.